You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. The London Metropolitan Police Commissioner says teachers, nurses and transport staff in the UK should face mandatory drug tests at work. In a speech to the all-party parliamentary group on cannabis and children, Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe said anyone who failed the mandatory tests and refused help to get clean should therefore lose their jobs. So is the Chief Police Commissioner right to suggest workers should be tested for drugs? Will the prospect of being tested for drugs at work put people off taking them in the first place? Or does it mean companies will be able to use a drug testing policy to get rid of staff more easily? So around the table to debate and answer those questions is Peter Reynolds, party leader of Cannabis Law Reform, and Mary Brett, trustee of Cannabis Skunk Sense Charity and also a former biology teacher, and Philip Landau, an employment lawyer at Landau Zeffert Weir Solicitors, acting for employees. So, should employees in the UK be tested for drugs at work? I'll come to you first, Mary.
Well, basically, yes. I mean, my sort of thought is if they've nothing to hide, why do they object? So I would say that people should be tested. We brought dogs in to the school. It was a police initiative. It was a grammar school I taught in. We brought in sniffer dogs, and before they brought them in, they had a survey. It was done over 6 schools in the area. 98% of parents wanted it, 92% of staff and 82% of pupils wanted the dogs brought in. Pupils mainly so that they had an excuse to refuse drugs. They wanted backup. Now 92% of the staff approved of it, and after they'd been for one visit it went up to 94% of the staff. And that meant obviously that staff were there could be tested as well. So there was no problem with it.
How are the dogs testing staff and pupils, or were they just sniffing out drugs, whether they had it on them or were they taking it?
The dogs were sniffing, staff, pupils alike. So the staff were being tested as well, and there were absolutely no objections to it.
And what results did you get from that?
There was never any found in the school I was in, and I believe it's the same for the others. It definitely acted as a deterrent, and as I say, it acted as an excuse for the boys. It was boys' grammar school I was in, because they didn't want to take drugs, and that was one of their biggest excuses to say no to people.
And so that you're saying that they needed that support from the school to introduce sniffer dogs to have the confidence to say no to drug pushers?
Well, it was another backup for them. I mean, I did the drug education and did it in a sort of scientific way. That gave them reasons why they shouldn't take drugs. So that was one thing. And the sniffer dogs just helped them, on top of that, to say no to drugs.
So you agree that drug testing should take place in the workplace. I'll come to you now, Philip Landau, as an employment lawyer. Where would teachers or where do employers stand if there's that 6% who didn't want to take part and yet they would be forced to because the majority of those did and the sniffer dogs came in?
Well, Julia, I mean, this does throw up human rights issues and civil liberties issues as well. The question is, from an individual's point of view who goes to work, why should they be forced to take mandatory drug testing when, if their performance is an issue, then employers should, and in the normal course of events do, pick up on that, and there are disciplinary procedures within the workplace in most employment workplaces that effectively deal with that. So if there was drug abuse by workers, then that should become apparent. If it's not apparent, then presumably their performance is not an issue, and therefore why should it be an issue for the employers if it's not an issue for the individual? So it's really, it does throw up a huge question mark over, as I said, human rights and civil liberties as to why people's freedoms should be violated in the workplace on a mandatory level.
OK then, Peter Reynolds, party leader of Cannabis Law Reform. Is this the right way to go about stopping people using cannabis, to introduce, as Sir Bernard suggested, mandatory drug testing in the workplace?
Well, I think there's two issues here. First of all, there's the issue of whether people who are in a responsible position, nurses or doctors or tube train drivers or whatever, whether they should be working whilst they're impaired. And I mean, I think it's quite clear that they shouldn't be. It's self-evident, it seems to me. The other issue is the human rights, civil liberties issue, and whether or not we should be introducing an iniquitous, oppressive, bullying culture, which is what Sir Bernard Hogan House seems to want. I mean, Sir Bernard's venture into this is, in my view, quite disgraceful venture by a policeman into the area of politics, which policemen are specifically prevented from doing so under the terms of the police regulations. And also, we seem to be getting the thing a little mixed up with the issue of children using drugs as well. I mean, clearly children shouldn't be using drugs. And quite how Sir Bernard transfers his speech, which was full of misinformation and incorrect scientific inaccuracy about cannabis, how he transfers that into this call for what, as I say, I would regard as an iniquitous. And if you're going to breathalyse these people as well, fair enough. But I mean, you can't be coming along and trying to sustain a government policy of prohibition, which is a complete and utter failure. You can't be coming along and trying to sustain it or improve it or give it a second chance by introducing policies which are iniquitous and oppressive.
Mary, then, what would your response be to Peter Reynolds as someone who's worked with children against the use of drugs?
Well, I mean, human rights works in all sorts of ways. Children have human rights as well, and they have rights not to be taught by teachers who are using drugs. I was having a look on the American sites to see what they were saying, and they came up with the figure of 4% of teachers were probably using drugs. And their performance might not seem to be impaired, but, I mean, if they're using, say, cannabis, which stays in the system for a long time, cannabis stays in the brain and stops the brain functioning to its full extent. It impairs the working of the brain, and therefore they're not giving correct teaching.
Is Peter fair in saying that if that's going to happen, then surely people should be breathalyzed in the same way as if they've drunk too much the night before?
Yes, I don't see why they're not breathalyzed as well, because that would be an issue. But as I said to him before, you can usually smell alcohol from someone, but you can't smell drugs normally.
The point also arises that if an employee is tested and is proved positive, how do you know that their work performance is a result of the drugs and not, for example, as a result of the fact they had a late night the night before, might have been partying on the weekend? You know, the employer has to make a judgment here that your performance is impaired because of the drugs, but that might not actually be the case. And yet, what's the employer supposed to do with that? The employee is tested positive. Are they supposed to dismiss them or discipline them, and which turns the employer effectively into a law enforcer? And where does it stop? I mean, for example, job applicants, are employers expected to check their house to see what might be there, or monitor their bank accounts to see what activity might be going on there? There is a fine line between
Absolutely.
an employer and a law enforcer.
Absolutely. And the other thing is that, I mean, there are many prescription drugs which are far more debilitating to people's work performance than cannabis would be, for instance. I think all the scientific evidence and the doctors would support the idea that alcohol is much more debilitating than cannabis. Again, I emphasise that nobody should be operating in one of these responsible positions while they're impaired in any way. But as I say, the government policy of prohibition of cannabis is a complete and utter failure. We consume more than 3 tons of cannabis every single day in this country. The market is worth $6 billion. If what we want to do is reduce the harms of cannabis, then what we need to do is take the market out of the hands of criminals and regulate it in a responsible and in a responsible fashion. This sort of backdoor attempt to try and enforce this unenforceable law is oppressive.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare, and we're discussing if drug testing employees would deter youngsters from taking up cannabis. I'm joined by Peter Reynolds, party leader of Cannabis Law Reform, Mary Brett, trustee of Cannabis Skunk Scent Charity and a former teacher, and Philip Landau, employment lawyer at Landau Zeffert Weir Solicitors.
Can I just point out as well that the reality is in most employment situations, certainly ones that deal with health, children, rail, maritime, they all have their policies anyway. There are workplace policies and best practice policies that says we can test you for drugs and alcohol abuse, which is not mandatory, but it is nevertheless a term of the contract. The employee can refuse testing, but if they do, then obviously implications can be made from that, and ultimately an employee can be disciplined. But the fact of the matter is that in most workplaces of note, there are these health and safety policies, and employers are under a duty under the Health and Safety Act 1974 to provide a safe working environment. And in industries such as health, education, etc., it means that they do have to ensure that their staff are drug and alcohol free, and most would do that anyway, or should do that.
I mean, I can tell you that I would much prefer to be in the hands, if you like, whatever profession we're talking about. I'd much prefer to be in the hands of someone who'd been smoking cannabis the night before than I would be in the hands of somebody who'd been drinking half a bottle of whiskey the night before.
You let out rather a big sigh earlier, Mary. What are you disappointed with in what perhaps Peter has to say?
I mean, Peter and I disagree violently on cannabis and its effects, and prohibition hasn't been a failure. Otherwise, we'd have more than 9% of the population, which is the percentage that take drugs at the moment. But I just don't see anything wrong. I mean, lots of workplaces, I looked again at the American sites, and there 57% of employment areas were testing pre-employment. They were testing candidates who were applying for jobs for drugs, and they found that the absentee rate went down, production went up, accident rate went down. All sorts of things could be attached to this. That's in the general workplace. I'm conscious I'm really only talking about schools today because that's what I know best. But I mean, teachers need the respect of pupils, and teachers need to earn that respect. And if you have teachers saying, no, I'm not going to be tested for drugs, they'll have a hard job with the children. Children have a very huge sense of justice and fairness, and they would be,
But the question is, Mary, should they be mandatory tested, or should they be tested if they show signs and symptoms that there may be drug abuse?
Well, they should certainly be tested if they show signs and symptoms.
Of course, I agree with that, yes. Okay. But should there be mandatory across the board, no matter who you are?
And I think it is in a lot of firms anyway.
Not mandatory, only in a very few
Well, a lot of it's in their contracts, isn't it? It's written into the contract that there might be random drug testing.
Yes, but it's not mandatory, though. That's the difference. Mm-hmm. Whereas what Sir Bernard is proposing is that there's a mandatory trusting you will be tested, no matter what. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, that can also work in all sorts of ways. If he says you'll be mandatory tested, then if somebody is using drugs and wants to give up, this will be an incentive for them to stop.
Indeed.
That's one other point you can make
but
there.
Perhaps for the vast majority that are not using drugs, you can understand the perception that their civil liberties are going to be adversely affected.
But if you
probably are using drugs, because if you include alcohol, which is the most dangerous and damaging drug of all, if you include that in this group of drugs, then the vast majority of people will be using drugs. So what you have to do, what you have to talk about, is to what extent you're able to or should be imposing on people's rights to do that outside the workplace. Again, making the important point that they should not be impaired whilst they're in the act of doing their job.
Well, the way employment tribunals have looked at this historically is that they certainly have not endorsed the fact that because you're taking drugs, it's a fair dismissal for the employer to say, right, you're out. They haven't done that. They've linked it to your ability to perform the work that you're doing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very important point. when does it become a disciplinary offence?
One of the other big issues about testing for cannabis is that the tests available for testing for cannabis don't measure impairment. You see, cannabis, the substances in cannabis that cause the high, the reason that people take cannabis, they're called cannabinoids. And our body also produces cannabinoids. There are exogenous cannabinoids that come from the cannabis plant, and there are endogenous cannabinoids that are produced within our body. So the chemicals, if you like, within cannabis are actually compatible with our body's chemistry. And for that reason, they stay in the body for anything up to 30, 40 days after use, whereas alcohol is a poison, and our body excretes it immediately. I mean, this in turn has led to a dreadful situation, dreadful enhanced drug harms in prisons. Because in prisons, people used to smoke cannabis, and then when mandatory drug testing was brought in prisons, people were being caught for smoking cannabis, up to a month, 6 weeks after they'd done so. And so what's actually happened in prisons is prisoners have turned to using heroin and cocaine because these substances are poisonous. They're not compatible with our body's chemistry. The body excretes them immediately, and so they can take those, and two days later they can test clean. But with cannabis, even when there's no evidence of impairment whatsoever, a month or 6 weeks later they can still be testing positive.
So it's not fair, essentially, because it only tests use rather than impairment.
That's right.
And so if you used cannabis on a weekend recreationally in your own private time, therefore why should an employer have the right to test you on a mandatory basis the next Wednesday?
Exactly.
And you test positive, and you would be either told to go for a rehabilitation program or you would face losing your job. Now, the question then I put again to you, Mary, is should someone's choice of a recreational drug, albeit illegal, on a weekend, should they be penalised in their working practice by being tested for it?
I don't see why they shouldn't. I mean, they're using an illegal drug, whatever the time of day is. And the business with THC is fat soluble. That's why it stays in the body for such a long time. Things like heroin, cocaine are water soluble, and they are very quickly out. Cannabis isn't compatible with the body because if it is, it would be discharged very quickly.
You still think there should be tests, even though it doesn't impair your performance at work? So you have a recreational drug over the weekend, but you're absolutely fine. You're going to work on a Monday morning. You still believe that it's right to have tests in those circumstances?
As I say, children should respect teachers, and if they're having joints and things at the weekend and coming in. And anyway, this impairment business, if you take cannabis, I've said this before, it will stay in the brain. It interferes with all the neurotransmitters, which are the chemicals which take the messages between nerve cells. This is all impaired. The brain is impaired. It slows down.
It's not true.
And it is true. And it will be like that for several days. 10% of the THC that is in a joint is still there after a month. And for weeks after that, you can find it in hair and urine.
Our body produces the chemically equivalent of THC, which is called anandamide. Our body also produces the chemical equivalent of CBD, which is called 2-AG. These substances are produced entirely naturally by our body, and that's why our body is happy for cannabinoids to remain in the system. It doesn't feel the need to excrete them straight away.
They do not have the same chemical composition. THC and anandamide are different chemicals. It's simply that they fit in to receptor sites.
Exactly. They have the same effect on the brain. They have the
But
same
bringing
effect on
it back,
They're
neurotransmitters.
not the same chemicals.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare, and we're discussing whether companies should be allowed to perform mandatory drug tests on employees like teachers. I'm joined by Mary Brett, trustee of Cannabis Skunk Sense charity and a former teacher herself, Peter Reynolds, party leader of Cannabis Law Reform, and Philip Landau, employment lawyer at Landau, Zeffert, Weir Solicitors. Listening to Peter and Mary here, you can hear the debate on the minutiae of just the impairment issue. What sort of minefield is this then for employees and employers? If mandatory drug testing was introduced, I mean, what happens next?
Exactly. I mean, there's obviously questions such as how do you do the testing? When do you do the testing? Who do you test against? what measure of a result triggers a disciplinary action. Is it any drugs in the system, or is it marginal drugs in the system? And then you've got situations like managers, for example, where you could have managers that are responsible for overseeing staff of 20, 30 people who might have some minutiae drugs in their system. Does that manager go? And that throws open whole commercial issues of companies.
I'll give you another example of this. Okay, there's problems going on with people at the moment with the DVLA, the Driver and Vehicle Licensing Agency, where completely arbitrarily the DVLA is removing people's licenses because they've received reports of them using cannabis. Now, as you may be aware, there is a cannabis medicine available in this country. It's called Sativex. It's a whole plant extract. It is cannabis. It contains all the same constituents that come from the cannabis plant. And I've actually spoken to the DVLA medical unit about this. And I've said to them, so if somebody's tested positive for cannabinoids in their system and they can show that they've got a prescription for cannabis, what's your position then? Oh, well, those are legal cannabinoids. So this exposes completely the absolute nonsense that there is here, because they're not. It is a backdoor attempt to enforce a failed government policy, because the only criteria we should be looking at is impairment.
It seems that any drugs debate always has skunk, cannabis, prohibition, wrong messages, right messages, and no one ever seems to get anywhere.
Kids actually don't want to take drugs, and they're looking for excuses to say no to their peer groups. They used to tell me that. I used to tell them the truth about cannabis, which isn't out there at the moment. I mean, Frank says cannabis stays in the body for 2 to 7 days. It doesn't. Frank says that skunk is about twice as strong as the old-fashioned herbal cannabis in the 60s and 70s. That was 1 or 2% THC. The average skunk THC level in 2008, because that's the last potency study they've done, was already 16.2%. So it's massively more strong. It can range up from that same report to about 46% THC in cannabis. So I used to tell the boys absolute truth about cannabis. And for instance, Frank ignores the immune system, they ignore the possibility of a gateway system. Children are simply not being told the truth about cannabis. And I've been battling with Frank for a long time over this.
Frank has become considerably more accurate in recent years, in actual fact. It is true that cannabis is, on average, stronger than it used to be. On average, it's about 2 to 3 times stronger than it used to be. But when we use the word stronger, we have to be very careful about what we're doing, because what Mary's referring to is the THC content. Now, as I said earlier, there are believed to be something in excess of 100 cannabinoids in cannabis. 66 of them have already been identified. And for instance, CBD, the other most prominent cannabinoid, has an ameliorating effect against the effects of THC. So the ratio of THC and CBD in the cannabis makes a huge difference to the effect it has.
But at the end of the day, Peter, it's whilst that may all be accepted. It's a civil liberty and human right issue that underpins
I agree with
all
you.
of this.
And the only criterion that we should be looking at on this is impairment. Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe's disgraceful venture into politics is an irrelevance. It's just him trying to score cheap brownie points. And I really don't see, as I said earlier, why he's bouncing this off a talk to the all-party parliamentary group on cannabis and children. Because obviously children shouldn't be using cannabis.
But I can't see it ever happening, can you? It's not likely to happen, mandatory drugs testing across the board. It may do in the medical profession and teaching profession, but it's certainly not going to happen across the board.
Do you think that it's more acceptable that it happens in the public sector professions?
I do. If you're looking after the, other people's interests, so the medical profession, the teaching profession, and lives depend on it, then yes, I think there is a much stronger argument that could be made for that. But it's interesting to note that the Royal College of Nursing don't support it, mandatory testing. They fall back on the best practice, which is let's have procedures in place to ensure that no drug taking is taking place, but not mandatory.
It's absurd to suggest that somebody should be able to lose their job for having smoked a joint the night before, whereas somebody else who's had 4 sprays of Sativex, which is 51% THC, shouldn't. I mean, it's just nonsense. Either somebody's impaired in some way or another and can't do their job properly, or they're not.
Let's just end the discussion with how you would want the discussion to continue, because you can go around in circles talking about cannabis, and as does the government in some way. So,
okay, well, the only purpose of any drugs policy must be to reduce harm. Of course, what the government says is to reduce use. Or if they don't even say to reduce use, they say to reduce misuse. Because there's an acceptance that you can use alcohol, although in fact most people misuse alcohol. But there's a suggestion that you can't use cannabis, you can only misuse cannabis. So as I say, the only basis of any drug policy must be to reduce harm. If we want to reduce the harms around cannabis, most of those harms are not caused by cannabis, they're caused by its illegality, or the fact that it's banned. You know, the fact that we have rented property being taken over and destroyed for illegal cannabis farms, the fact that we have young children finding it easier to get hold of cannabis than it is to get hold of alcohol, because the only ID that a dealer asks for is a £20 note. You know, and what our government has done, and it's both political parties, what they've done is they've abandoned our children and abandoned our society to crime. They've abandoned them to street dealers and criminals. You know, it's completely irresponsible policy. It's a policy that's based on scientific myth and scare story, and what we need to do is take responsibility, take this £6 billion market out of the black economy, put it into the hands of responsible retailers who will ask for ID if there's any doubt about the person's age, and deal with it that way.
From a legal perspective, is there a new debate you would like to see happen?
Well, I'll defer to my colleagues here in terms of the technicalities surrounding cannabis, but what I would say is, as a deterrent, if there was mandatory drugs testing in the workplace, I have little doubt that there would be a significant drop in the use. Because, I mean, I see people who lose their jobs every day. And this economic climate, it can take, I've seen people take year and a half before they secure new employment in some industries. So if there was that mandatory drugs testing, they would be certainly fearful for their jobs. And I think, on the whole, it's a good idea, putting aside the civil liberties argument. It's never going to happen, not in my lifetime, I don't think. But as for the alternatives, that's open to my two colleagues here, I think.
I think you certainly deserve the last word, because I think we've probably been a little bit one-sided in an approach. But do you think then, what Peter says, that we've abandoned the children to a life of crime, and the government has abandoned the children? Where do you think the debate should go?
The debate, it should be, we should try to prevent, go right the way back from, go to childhood. In schools, try to prevent. During the Just Say No campaign in the States, over 70% of kids didn't take cannabis because of the harm that it would do to their body psychologically and physically. There was a survey done here in 2005, my school took part in it, along similar lines, and over 90% of children were put off taking any drug because of the physical and psychological harm. So that's where we need to target children in school and give them the truth.
So you would put that ahead of mandatory drug testing in the workplace?
I think there's no substitute for really good preventative education. And what is in place now, and has been for the last 10 years, is harm reduction education. And what that says is, kids are going to use drugs anyway, let's show them how to do it safely. And that isn't true, because kids are not going to use drugs anyway.
I'd like to thank all my guests: Peter Reynolds, the party leader of Cannabis Law Reform; Mary Brett, the trustee of Cannabis Skunk Sense Charity; Philip Landau, an employment lawyer at Landau Zeffert Weir Solicitors. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. The London Metropolitan Police Commissioner says teachers, nurses and transport staff in the UK should face mandatory drug tests at work. In a speech to the all-party parliamentary group on cannabis and children, Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe said anyone who failed the mandatory tests and refused help to get clean should therefore lose their jobs. So is the Chief Police Commissioner right to suggest workers should be tested for drugs? Will the prospect of being tested for drugs at work put people off taking them in the first place? Or does it mean companies will be able to use a drug testing policy to get rid of staff more easily. So around the table to debate and answer those questions is Peter Reynolds, party leader of Cannabis Law Reform, and Mary Brett, trustee of
Education, and did it in a sort of scientific way. That gave them reasons why they shouldn't take drugs. So that was one thing, and the sniffer dogs just helped them, on top of that, to say no to drugs.
So you agree that drug testing should take place in the workplace. I'll come to you now, Philip Landau, as an employment lawyer. Where would teachers or where do employers stand if there's that 6% who didn't want to take part and yet they would be forced to because the majority of those did and the sniffer dogs came in?
Well, Julia, I mean, this does throw up human rights issues and civil liberties issues as well. The question is, from an individual's point of view who goes to work, why should they be forced to take mandatory drug testing when, if their performance is an issue, then employers should, and in the normal course of events do, pick up on that, and there are disciplinary procedures within the workplace in most employment workplaces that effectively deal with that. So if there was drug abuse by workers, then that should become apparent. If it's not apparent, then presumably their performance is not an issue, and therefore why should it be an issue for the employers if it's not an issue for the individual? So it's really, it does throw up a huge question mark over, as I said, human rights and civil liberties as to why people's freedoms should be violated in the workplace on a mandatory level.
OK, then, Peter Reynolds, party leader of Cannabis Law Reform. Is this the right way to go about stopping people using cannabis to introduce, as Sir Bernard suggested, mandatory drug testing in the workplace?
Well, I think there's two issues here. First of all, there's the issue of whether people who are in a responsible position, nurses or doctors or tube train drivers or whatever, whether they should be working whilst they're impaired. And I think it's quite clear that they shouldn't be.
Cannabis Skunk Sense charity and also a former biology teacher. And Philip Landau, an employment lawyer at Landau Zeffert Weir Solicitors, acting for employees. So, should employees in the UK be tested for drugs at work? I'll come to you first, Mary.
Well, basically, yes. I mean, my sort of thought is, if they've nothing to hide, why do they object? So I would say that people should be tested. We brought dogs in to the school. It was a police initiative. It was a grammar school I taught in. We brought in sniffer dogs, and before they brought them in, they had a survey. It was done over 6 schools in the area. 98% of parents wanted it, 92% of staff and 82% of pupils wanted the dogs brought in. Pupils mainly so that they had an excuse to refuse drugs. They wanted backup. Now 92% of the staff approved of it, and after they'd been for one visit it went up to 94% of the staff. And that meant obviously that staff were there could be tested as well. So there was no problem with it.
How are the dogs testing staff and pupils, or were they just sniffing out drugs, whether they had it on them or were they taking it?
The dogs were sniffing, staff, pupils alike. So the staff were being tested as well, and there were absolutely no objections to it.
And what results did you get from that?
There was never any found in the school I was in, and I believe it's the same for the others. It definitely acted as a deterrent, and as I say, it acted as an excuse for the boys. It was boys' grammar school I was in, because they didn't want to take drugs, and that was one of their biggest excuses to say no to people.
And so that you're saying that they needed that support from the school to introduce sniffer dogs to have the confidence to say no to drug pushers?
Well, it was another backup for them. I mean, I did the drug edge